In the previous slide, we addressed the question, why are there immigrants from, say, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos? And the answer to that question was linked to a particular historical logic, if you recall. Um, the reason why there's immigrants from Indochina is because the United States went there first. And by the way, this is a map of that, what I call the colonial geographic construction, Indochina, which includes Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and these were colonies of the French Empire. So, what we need to discuss is how did the United States become involved in the Vietnam War, which is a very complicated question, I should say, but it deserves a little bit of discussion because it's crucial to understand the historical backdrop to this. And as indicated in the slide there, it's a Cold War context here. In case you're not familiar with the Cold War, it's basically the war that was not a hot war, meaning a military war, but largely a war of ideology between the USSR and its ally, the People's Republic of China, against the United States and our allies. And we called ourselves the free world. And we also had this sort of tabulation of the world divided into three parts. There was the first world, which included the United States and our allies. Again, we called ourselves the free world. The second world was the Soviet Union, China. And in contrast to the first world, which is, in the economic sense, capitalist and politically it's democratic, what we see in the second world is socialism. The economic and political system of socialism. And, that means that the state is highly involved in the affairs of society in a general sense. Okay. All right. So the third world also, what is that? The third world is or are former countries that used to be colonized by the great European empires. We're talking, the English Empire, the French Empire, the German Empire later on, the Spanish Empire. All these empires used to control territory outside Europe to the point where, and I previously mentioned this in a different topic, by the turn of the 20th century, over 90% of the globe was controlled in some shape or form by some European empire, whether through direct colonialism or at the very least control of the economy. So it deserves mention here. This was the age of European imperialism, which lasted roughly from 1700 through 1914. And what is 1914? It's the beginning of, it's the outbreak of World War One. Okay. Now, what World War One is basically an imperial war, European empires going at it. And the reason why it became a global war, hence the term World War, is because they had colonies strewn all over the globe. So that meant that colonies got dragged into the war. For example, if you had a colony in Asia or Africa, let's say the French Empire, and they're fighting against the German Empire, well, that meant that with German colonies in Africa or Asia, once they confront each other, they fight, right? So it basically becomes global in scope, this World War, hence the term again. Now, what's important to remember about World War One is that it was so devastating that it led to the collapse of this European imperial system. Stated otherwise, the European empires could no longer hold on to their overseas colonies in Asia, in Africa, in the Caribbean, and what we call the Middle East. So what you have here is the widespread movement of decolonization. Now, to be accurate, there's World War II, and you could, in many ways, consider World War II as continuous with World War One. But in the context of global colonialism, what happens definitely after World War II is a massive movement known as decolonization. All right. So, as the term states here, decolonization was this global process whereby former colonies across the world were now given independence. Sometimes they were granted independence by their colonial masters. At other times, they had to fight a war in order to throw off the yoke of colonial rule and imperial rule. Okay, so what does this have to do with Indochina? Well, Indochina was exactly, as I mentioned, a former colonial possession of the French Empire. But France did not just surrender Vietnam. They didn't just give them independence. Actually, they fought a pretty bitter war in the 1950s. And by 1954, the French were defeated by the nationalist Vietnam, guerrilla forces, really. And they were forced to give up, relinquish their control of Vietnam. Okay, so going back to that ranking of the world, like I mentioned, the first world, the second world, what you have here with the third world are former colonies. Okay, and still we use the term third world today. Even the term first world is used sometimes. These are Cold War terms. The third world, the way you should think about it, however, is in the context of decolonization. Third world nations were former colonies of European empires. Okay, they're non-European, and it's important to emphasize because, Europeans, in terms of race, they're lighter skin. Uh, Third world persons are darker skin. Okay, what happened was Europe went out and colonized places, and the populations did not look like them physically. They were darker skin and just different um, phenotypes, to use a biological term. All right, so this is important to recognize here in the context of Vietnam and Indochina in general. As I mentioned, in 1954, France was forced to let go of its colony. But after that, in Vietnam, you still had bitter rivalry between the socialist, led by Ho Chi Minh, and the nationalist. And the nationalists were led, or let's just say they were allied to the United States. Okay. Um, and what's going to happen later on is Vietnam's going to be divided into two areas: the North, which would be socialist, and the South, which would be an ally of the First World. Now, this is what's important also to remember in this Cold War context, is that the First World and the Second World, USSR and China, they're trying to win the allegiance and the alignment of the various countries that are becoming decolonized in Asia, in Africa, in the Caribbean. And in other words, they're trying to attract them into their orbit of the first world or into their orbit of the second world. Okay, they're trying to convince, let's say, countries newly formed or newly independent Africans. They're trying to convince to say, hey, you should really be a member of the first world. We represent freedom and democracy. Or here's the USSR spreading a message that, hey, you should be a member of our second world. We preach socialism. And socialism, I should mention, is very attractive in the minds of many former colonial countries. Why is this? Because it preaches equality. Now, as Americans, we're not used to, well, let's say it's hard to look at socialism in a sort of impartial way because we've really been taught since the beginning of our schooling and certainly with just, USS ideology, United States ideology that, socialism is bad. Okay, but for former colonized people, it's very attractive. So this is a tug of war. And the phrase here is winning the hearts and minds. Okay, the United States was trying to win, quote, the hearts and minds of people of the third world, trying to urge them trying to convince them to join the First World. Okay, now this involves the Vietnam War, because what happens is, if you look here at this term called the policy of containment, the policy of containment was basically the foreign policy that was enacted by our foreign policy elite, right? The the Secretary of State, right? Let's just call it the State Department and so forth. And of course, the Secretary of Defense, the Defense Department. Well, they decided to come up with this policy when it came to dealing with the USSR in parts of the Third World. And what does this mean, containment? It basically is an approach whereby policymakers, wherever, let me first say this, actually. Let me first state that policymakers in the United States assumed that Russian and Chinese policymakers were engaged in spreading socialism on a global level. Just like we want to spread democracy on a global level, and we still do today, as we saw in Afghanistan and Iraq, well, it was believed that so too did the foreign policy apparatus of the USSR. They desired to spread socialism all over the world. So it was felt the way to stop this was to, quote, contain it, and hence the term containment, to contain it at certain key geopolitical areas of the world. Okay, now in this map before you, here's China, which is all socialists by 1949. They had a civil war before that, and Mao and the socialist forces won that civil war. Hence, the People's Republic of China became communist or socialist. Now, as I just discussed, by the 1950s, Vietnam is in this civil war. Who's going to take control, right? The socialist or the non-socialist, the nationalist. But what we felt we should do, and this is aligned to the policy of containment, is become involved in Vietnam, because it was a key geopolitical point, which our foreign policy elite speculated would lead to the spread of socialism below China. And it was felt that if we didn't stop it right at Vietnam, right here, right, then it would spread throughout Asia. And before we know it, all of Asia would become socialist. They would align with the second world and not the first world, our, orbit. Okay, so we felt we needed to exert some kind of pressure here, okay, military pressure even. And hence we became involved in Vietnam in particular with the Vietnam War, and Indochina in general. Now, what does Laos and Cambodia have to do with the Vietnam War? We know they're neighbors, right? Well, for starters, North Vietnam had a supply route that ran along the western border of North Vietnam and actually spilled over into Laos at certain areas. Okay, and the supply route, it was called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, was basically used to supply, North Vietnamese troops and the Viet Cong, the guerrilla troops, in the more southern regions of the military conflict. So what we did is bomb, and we bombed the heck out of it, okay, of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and we expanded a lot of bombs in Laos. And later on in the 1970s, this would happen in Cambodia too. There'd be a lot of bombs dropped, in Cambodia. And furthermore, I mentioned this earlier, the Hmong tribe, the Hmong people, HMONG, our CIA actually sponsored the Hmong to fight against the communists within Laos. Okay, and they supplied us with, help in, intelligence information. They rescued downed pilots, and of course, direct military conflict. And then in Cambodia, what was really terrible about Cambodia was the civil war in here between the military troops loyal to the government and the socialist troops. And the socialist troops won in 1975. And after that, as I mentioned previously, you had the genocide, the Cambodian genocide, where 2 million people were basically murdered. Okay, so all this explains our involvement. Of course, this is a very condensed version, right? An abridged version of our involvement in Indochina, but we should be aware of all these terms, right? Because it figures prominently in the historical backdrop as to why the United States became involved in Vietnam or Indochina in general in the first place. And again, that's going to lead to this corollary migration movement. As a result of our intervention in that part of the world called Indochina, the result was Indochinese migration, or to use our term earlier, Indochinese diaspora. This significant migration of persons from Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia to the United States by the mid 1970s.